Now, Henry Pelham, as it says next to me, is the man who really did the Boston Massacre engraving. Now, I am going to show you a picture of the engraving in just a second, but just so you know, I am speaking about the famous picture of the Boston Massacre, the one that everyone saw, and the one that Paul Revere was made famous for engraving. It's one of the earliest forms of American propaganda, and it really drove a lot of people towards the American cause. But we're talking about Henry Pelham. Now, Henry Pelham was born in America, and his father died young. Unfortunately, his father had a bit of an untimely death, but he had a much older half-brother whose name was John Singleton Copley. And you might recognize the name John Singleton Copley. John Singleton Copley was an American founder. I'm sorry, not an American founder, a famous artist, a portrait artist for the most part, but he did many things. Now, John Singleton Copley actually grows up, and he does this painting of Henry Pelham, his younger brother. And this painting of his younger brother ends up making him fairly renowned as an artist. And John Singleton Copley ends up going over to London just, I believe it's 1775, just as the American Revolution is breaking out. Really because if you wanted to make it as an artist, you really should go to London or somewhere in Europe. So he goes to London and becomes John Singleton Copley. His brother, Henry Pelham, also becomes an artist, not quite as well known, but when the Boston Massacre happens, Henry Pelham does an engraving of the Boston Massacre, and he shows his friend, Paul Revere. And Paul Revere then goes and essentially steals it. And Henry Pelham gets very upset because he wanted everyone to see his, and he trusted Paul Revere. And it took Henry Pelham 3 weeks to get his printed, and Paul Revere only 2. And I'm going to show you right now a side by side, and this is from the Massachusetts Historical Society, so big shout out to them. But these are the engravings. So the one on the left is Paul Revere, and the one on the right is Henry Pelham. Now, as you can see, there is a lot of similarities between these two. I mean, right down to the point where, if you look down at the bottom here, they both have a dog, they both have a guy pouring blood out of exactly the same spot, guy lying on the ground here, guy grabbing a leg over here, and if we scroll up, I mean, it's essentially the same painting. I will say the one on the right, which is Henry Pelham's, is a lot more detailed. It looks a lot nicer. And the way you can really tell them apart is the moons are facing different directions. Is one of the several things I've read and have seen. Also, Pelham has some hands in the air, and Paul Revere does not. Paul Revere is a lot more crude, which is, again, I think, extremely fascinating. I'll pull my things back up here. So that is a comparison between Henry Pelham's engraving and Paul Revere's engraving. Now, you can see how Pelham would be quite upset. In fact, I read a very interesting letter, which I believe is linked to in my article, Pelham writing to Paul Revere, basically saying, hey, Paul, you stole my stuff. I let you look at mine, and you copied it. To which I did not find a very good answer to Paul Revere, but very interesting in the letter. It's a very brief letter calling out Paul Revere's honor, which I'm a little surprised it didn't lead to a duel, because he's very specifically calling out Paul Revere's honor. And then at the end he says, oh yeah, by the way, my mother's still hoping to get those cufflinks you promised you'd make for her. It wasn't cufflinks, but Paul Revere is a silversmith. You still owe my mom that silver. By the way, can we get that errand done? Now, Henry Pelham ends up shortly thereafter moving to London and essentially becoming a loyalist. He becomes fairly outspoken against the Patriots, probably in large part due to Paul Revere being kind of a jerk. Now, I will also note, a lot of other people end up stealing this same picture. It is kind of the thing to do, to steal pictures like this. But he ends up going to London, rejoins his brother over there, and ends up spending the rest of his life over in Europe. So he's on the fringe of a founder, but again, it was his Henry Pelham's little engraving that inspired Paul Revere's engraving, which is now arguably the most famous picture from the American Revolution itself.